Wait for YouTube to pick up the stream, which is now. And hello, everybody. Welcome to Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel. I'm Marshall, and I am here today with Tack, who is going to talk about his latest scenario, which is the Battle of Cape Vincent. But before we do that, I have some exciting news for you. Our website is pretty much in order. It still needs a fair bit of work, but it is largely put together by now. We have some really cool stuff here. In particular, under the resources tabs, I want folks to be able to come check this out. Check out the resources. We've got books, we've got maps, rules, you name it. So let's just check out maps here. Here's where you can get the various atlases, where we pull all of our maps for the games, and that's all up on here. We also have rule sets. You can get all the different rule sets. So if you're looking for rules to play Kriegsspiel, this is where you want to come to get these. We have the originals. We also have our more modern rule sets. Also, our store, Craig's Depot, we have all kinds of stuff in here. Apparently, people wanted Crocs. I'm beside myself that I even had to create that product. But there we go. We have lots of products here, including the hoodies. It's a great way to represent the brand, and you can come on here and buy those at any time. All right, that's enough commercial advertisement now. Let's take a look at the Battle of Cape Vincent. And I'm going to let Tack here kind of drive. I'm going to let him tell us about why did he choose this scenario? How did he go about building this and setting this up? And then what did he expect and kind of what happened? And then we'll kind of go for there. Now I know those are a lot of loaded questions. If you don't remember, I'll repeat them. But I'm going to let you kind of take it away. Tell us the story, Tack, of the Battle of Cape Vincent as we played it on Saturday.
All right. Well, for some quick historical background to it, the Battle of Cape St. Vincent was 1797. So it's in the Napoleonic Wars. It's Wars of the First Coalition, I believe. It's right at that kind of at that time. You have the French fleet is up at Brest in Brittany, France. It's not quite big enough to deal with the Royal Navy. Sorry. You have the Spanish fleet, which is actually in the Mediterranean, at least the bulk of it is. And you have the Royal Navy that's kind of blockading everywhere. The Spanish are French aligned in this, and ultimately the Spanish fleet wants to combine with the French fleet to form a fleet large enough to force the Royal Navy to give battle and lose and break the blockade. Um, as the Spanish fleet comes out of Gibraltar, they manage to slip past, and they get caught with a very bad wind. It's called a levanter coming in from the east that pushes them far out to sea.
Mm-hmm.
The Apologies, Marshall, having a small technical difficulty.
Okay, no worries. So I'll just draw out what Tack has kind of explained. And this is sort of the history. This is the history which informed the scenario. I find it curious that he used a historic scenario and setup. But here you go. You have the Spanish here. You have the British. And I don't know historically where they were. I know in the game we kind of started down here. They could have been anywhere, but in either case, the Spanish did slip by.
Yep. So historically, the Spanish slipped by. Uh, Admiral Vice Admiral John Jervis later would be Earl St. Vincent because of this battle.
Mm.
Get He's commanding the Royal Navy forces in the area. They've been somewhat reinforced, but they're decent size, but they're not. It's not a large fleet by the standards of the time. The Spanish get swept far out to sea, and ultimately their goal had been to come out of the Strait of Gibraltar and arrive at the port of Cadiz, which is right here.
Mm-hmm.
The port of Cadiz was the only major Spanish port on the Atlantic side until you got all the way around into the Bay of Biscay. So that was their original goal. They missed it. They missed it because the wind swept them out to sea quite a distance, and then they were coming back over several days towards the port of Cadiz.
Were they fighting the wind as they came back?
To some degree, they were, although obviously winds shift back and forth. For the scenario, I chose a wind that would actually be somewhat favorable to them, rather than have them beat into the wind the whole time, as we had a lot of players without experience in naval games, and I didn't want to make it hard mode on the first outing.
Sure.
So ultimately, the Royal Navy's got approximately 15 ships that matter. Your ships of the line, frigates in a fleet battle. While frigates get all the glory in battles, and especially for us Americans, frigates get all the glory because the United States famously didn't have a line of battle for the longest time, so it was all our frigates that got the glory for those single ship engagements. A line of battle engagement is a completely different animal, in that frigates, historically, they scouted, they screened, and they got out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
In the stream, I kind of explained it, that you would wind up having approximately 3 separate battles in a naval engagement at this time, because you'd have the line of battle engagement, and then the frigates would engage each other. And then if you had unrated ships, which are ships smaller than approximately 28 guns, you would wind up with them having an engagement. A few other things to keep in mind is, for people coming from a land combat perspective in the Napoleonic era into a naval combat perspective, the flagship of the Royal Navy and the flagship of the Spanish Navy in this engagement, each of them separately has more firepower than the entire Battle of Waterloo.
Wow.
By weight of shot. You have, because in land combat, a 12-pound field gun, maybe a 24-pound howitzer, that's about as big as you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
In a naval engagement, these ships are running 32, 36, and some of them were even running 42-pound guns, and they were running an entire deck of those.
Wow.
HMS Victory's lower deck was 32-pounders, and she had in total 100 guns. Now, that's split between different calibers, but the smallest guns used at sea were the biggest guns used on land.
Mm-hmm.
So the amount of destructive potential of these ships is immense once they actually engage. For the battle, I did stage that the Spanish were staged over here. I'm sorry, I'm having this module is only my second module outing, so it's not.
We could just drop a collection of blocks here. We'll just drop some blocks.
Yeah, we'll just drop some blocks,
and
because
that will kind of indicate their approximate position, and we can actually even duplicate blocks. I know, they had like 3 big ships of the line. They had a lot of smaller ships of the line.
Ultimately, for the scenario,
the Spanish
had 22 ships.
Okay. All right. So there's our Spanish fleet for the moment in aggregate.
Yep. And in aggregate, the British fleet had the historical number of ships. And I'm counting, when I say ships, I'm meaning ships that matter. So I didn't include the unrated ships in this engagement. I barely included the frigates. Primarily, this is a ship of the line engagement. And in a battle, when you hear they had 32 ships, most of the time that's that's them counting ships of the line involved,
Hmm.
because in a line of battle engagement, frigates are a sideshow. Normally, the frigates on the losing team would just run after the battle if they weren't just captured outright.
Okay.
That's just how that goes. So,
Yeah, we had about four of those frigates.
yep, yeah. Each side had the Spanish had 6 or 8 frigates, and the British side had 4. The Spanish had 22 ships of the line. Historically, they had 25. In this scenario, one of the things about historical battles, and this counts for land and sea, when you're trying to make a historical battle into a Kriegsspiel, is you have to keep in mind that your victories that are amazing, your to go way back into antiquity, your Alexander at Issus and Gogmala, those are amazing victories because they shouldn't happen.
Hmm.
The battles that you read about, most of them, Waterloo's kind of an exception, but the battles that you read about, most of them are amazing victories because they shouldn't have been. They should have been a defeat,
Right.
and ultimately they were not.
And they're also bigger and more decisive than the average, typical, everyday garden variety engagement.
Correct.
I think
So
that's one of the things I've learned running Kriegspiel is that your average Napoleonic skirmish was actually quite small and ended in just a matter of minutes. Not every day was Waterloo. You know, Waterloo gets the attention that it gets because it's this huge, tremendous one-off that was very decisive. And that's the same with all these battles. The problem is, we read these histories about these big battles and we think that was the typical battle, and that's not typical. That's not everyday Napoleonic War. That's just the one-offs. And of course, it applies to naval combat as well.
exactly. And when you look at, for our American viewers, when you look at the American Civil War, the reason the Eastern Theater gets all of the glory and all of the major battles is because the Eastern Theater, you had 2 massive armies so close to each other. People forget Richmond to DC is 90 miles. That is 4, maybe 5 days of marching.
Yeah.
So you can fight the entire campaign in a week.
Wow.
And because you have such a tight battle space, and the whole area of Northern Virginia and into kind of the edges of Southern Maryland was devastated by the war because both armies were sitting on it for 4 years. And because that's so tight, you have nothing. You kind of have a situation where you do have nothing but big battles because everybody can bring everything to bear at once.
Right.
But as you go into the Western campaign, it's a lot of small engagements with the occasional big fight, which is more realistic when you have the room to maneuver. Armies didn't want to have a big battle because even if you win a big battle, you've still lost a lot of gear and a lot of men.
Yeah, you burned a lot of powder. It takes time to recover from that.
Correct.
Yeah.
So so anyway, the Spanish mission in this battle was their primary goal is to make Cadiz. Their secondary goal, if they cannot make Cadiz, is to make it around and over around the Cape.
Hmm.
So they're not allowed to simply say, "Nope, we're not even going to see if the British are here. We're just going to go around the Cape."
Hmm.
They have to at least make an attempt because Cadiz is expecting them. Over
Hmm.
here is where their government's expecting them to be and wondering why they're late.
Hmm.
And this is an era where people, you can't just radio. If a ship's not in port, it's not telling you anything.
Right.
So you have to make that contact in order to do that. So that was the Spanish mission. The British mission is the Spanish fleet is out here somewhere, and historically, uh, Nelson was actually commanding HMS Captain during the battle itself, and that was where Commodore Nelson. So he wasn't even he wasn't an admiral at this time. He was just a captain who had been promoted to Commodore, which was a kind of a you were allowed to command multiple ships, but you're not an admiral yet.
Hmm.
And that was how that worked because the British promotional system, once you made captain, was by seniority. There was so you could be a captain for the rest of your career and never be promoted.
Mhm.
So they would make commodores in order to have a captain that's allowed to command multiple vessels. The He got on HMS Minerva, one of the frigates, and sailed it through the Spanish fleet. They knew the Spanish fleet was out there, but they didn't know how many ships it was, and they didn't know where it was. So he wound up sailing a frigate through the Spanish fleet and out the other side, and realized what it was. And the Spanish were not the best sailors. The Royal Navy at this point in history, because the Dutch have kind of ceased to exist as a naval power. The Royal Navy was the finest sailors on the planet. Were the Royal Navy,
Mhm.
as far as navigation, as far as training, experience at sea. Royal Navy ships would go out and stay out for long periods of time, whereas Spanish, French, the continental navies tended to only go out for short periods of time or to go straight to their colonies and back. They didn't maintain large seagoing forces.
Mhm.
So that's your historical context. The Spanish were firing signal guns the night before the battle in order to kind of keep the formations together in the dark, because they didn't know how to do that as well as the British did. So
Mhm.
the British were basically able to sneak into position to force a battle that the Spanish didn't want. The
Mhm.
whole Spanish objective historically was to get to Cadiz, was to get away. They didn't want to fight.
Right.
They wanted to combine with the French. They actually they got they while they outnumbered the British by 10 ships in the historical engagement, they were in their nightmare scenario,
Mhm.
even though the British were outnumbered.
Mhm.
Now, so anyway, from the actual game, both teams were allowed to have a quarterdeck conference, as I would call it, where they're all on the flagship, or in our case, they're all in the same room on Discord, having making their battle plan, which is
Right.
historical. They would have conferences if there was time. The different commanders would get on small boats and go between
Mhm.
ships and have conference. Now, once you have that sort of in-person conference, a big difference between land Kriegsspiel and naval Kriegsspiel, especially Age of Sail naval, is that your only way to communicate is at night by lanterns, or during the day, or you can fire signal guns, or during the
Mhm.
day by flags. So I enforced flag discipline by minimizing the amount of words that could be sent in a single message. Turns were 5 minutes, because 5 minutes is a long time when you're firing a broadside every minute to 2 minutes, and a broadside could be as many as 50 or 60 guns. So you were able to, if you had a line of sight and you were within, on this map, if you were within 14 grids, which would roughly equal moderate cannon range to an enemy ship, you could actually and you could actually see the flags and be able to interpret what they were.
Mhm.
So obviously, a big part of the IKS is to make Kriegsspiel accessible, and not just a thing for people that are intensely interested in the era to
Right.
be able to do. So instead of forcing true flag discipline, although the Royal Navy team decided to create their own flag system, what I set was an 8-word maximum. You could send 8 words to another ship in your dispatch, so to speak.
Mhm. Does that
As
include
long
coordinating conjunctions like a, in, and, but,
Not really,
or,
not really. I wasn't
to,
I wasn't going to enforce. I wasn't
prepositions? Yeah. Okay.
It was going to be, if the word was a keyword for the thing, like go to um coordinates or go to location, then the two would count. But if it was
A is
it,
and it
yeah,
to.
yeah,
Yeah.
not really worried about those, as long as they weren't. It was basically 8 operative words in.
Perfect. Yeah. I asked that because if somebody's watching this and they have in their mind, well, I want to do something similar, but do I count that as a word? I want them to have your expert answer on that from your experience, whether or
As
not
far
to
as
allow
that
that or count it or what.
as far as that goes, I would say when you enforce a word limit on dispatches for a live game, for a play by post, you can enforce very specific things. If you're
Hmm.
doing a live game and you're going to enforce a word limit, limit it to operative words and use discretion. If they're trying to maintain within the spirit of the rule,
Hmm.
let it fly. As long as they're not. So if one player that's sent two or three signals that are two or three words over the course of the game, they send a 9 or 10 word signal. They're not actively trying to game the system.
Right.
It's something that's reasonable and just let it happen. And that's a big part of the umpire's job is to decide is it reasonable
Hmm.
and make that determination. But it did that does change. That's probably the biggest difference between naval Kriegsspiel and land Kriegsspiel. In a land Kriegsspiel, the general of the army is not really typically directly commanding anything unless they do things that some of us are wont to do, such as run in and take over one particular unit to fill a hole in the line. They're not commanding anything directly. They're sending dispatches back and forth, and that's their job
Right.
is to send dispatches, is to ride to other commanders and conference with them, get their own view of the battlefield, decide where that key point is, and make things happen. In a naval Kriegsspiel, Age of Sail naval, because there are systems that are in process for more modern naval Kriegsspiels. You have the admiral is the admiral of the whole fleet, but he's got a flag captain commanding the ship he's on, but he's also technically in command of that squadron or
Hmm.
that division of the battle line. So you'll have Nelson at Trafalgar he's commanding the whole fleet at Trafalgar. He's also commanding kind of HMS Victory, although he's got a flag captain that's doing the more mundane day-to-day parts of it. And he's also got several other ships that are following Victory directly, and they're that's his squadron. So
Hmm.
in we use the Royal Navy because in this one you had HMS Victory was here, and it was commanding a squadron of ultimately 3 ships, and then there was another squadron behind it. But the Carter who was playing Admiral Jervis in this scenario, he had a command that was that size,
Hmm.
not just not just his one ship, but then your overall commander has more work in that regard, but at the same time he's on a ship. He's not capable of flitting from place to place.
Right.
We're not dealing with a modern naval warfare where the commanding admiral has a combat information center, and he's able to network into all his other ships and directly talk to all of their commanders.
Right.
He's restricted to signals in the same way everybody else is.
Yeah. To overcome that, we developed our own little signal system, our flag system, where letters and numbers indicated, uh, particularly common orders and designations. So, as I recall, Carter was A, I was the letter B. My subordinate, who was Ninja Bushido, was his name. He was letter D, and so on. F stood for frigates, and then we had like 25 different likely orders, and we had everything on a table in a spreadsheet, and we just consulted that to easily decipher the orders, and that allowed us to stay well within the limit on the card or whatever. Actually, we just posted it into Discord, and that represents, of course, the length of the line on the mast where we could hang the flags. So we were able to convey orders with like a single one or two flags instead of having to, spell everything out letter by letter, which I think made things quick and efficient. And I think the Spanish had something similar going on, but I don't think it was as detailed as ours.
Yeah, they had a system. It was not as detailed, and that was something that was interesting from the umpire perspective because there were systems. Navies developed their own flag codes, which
Mm-hmm.
were in use all the way up. One of the last times that flag codes would have been used in a major battle was Jutland,
Mm-hmm.
because the British were famously against using the wireless because you
Mm-hmm.
could triangulate positions of the fleet. It was one of the reasons they were able to track the Germans so well, is the German fleet used wireless for just about everything. And on the one hand, the British fleet not using the wireless helped conceal them. On the other hand, it also meant that certain things, such as the poor signaling by one certain Admiral Beatty, was exacerbated because nobody was getting on the wireless to just ask him, what in the world did you just say?
Right.
So you kind of have it is a double-edged sword. So that's ultimately what you wind up with in a naval Kriegsspiel, is far more isolation for each commander.
Yeah, and
And
that was terrifying for me personally because I I I mean I don't win very often. I'm not very good at Kriegsspiel, which is probably shocking to people. But apparently I don't quite have the knack for it like some other people do. And then I find myself where I'm basically in a quasi or semi-autonomous situation where I just kind of have general orders or instructions, and what to do in detail really falls on me. The problem is, it's not like where I'm in a land engagement and I could say, oh, I made a little mistake here. Let's go ahead and return to this previous position, or let's refuse the flank, or let's call for reinforcements. No, every time I make a decision, I have to live with the implications of that decision pretty much for the rest of the game because I'm on a ship, there's inertia, there's wind. I agonized over whether to turn right or left at one point in the battle. And I agonized also when to turn. And there was just a lot of that going on, which are not typical scenarios I face when I play land Kriegspiels. Land Kriegspiels, you can countermarch, and on the very next turn or two, you're back to your original position. Can't do that here.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
And in a and to kind of go into that, so in a for a and I'll grab one of these Royal Navy squadrons to demonstrate it. So when you have this squadron here,
Right.
and it's sailing this direction,
Okay.
and you need to go this way. And we're going to take the wind out of this and assume that the wind is not going to be a problem. However, you do have wind, and if the wind is blowing this way, now you have to make the decision on, depending on what your situation is to your front, do you turn to port to your left, or do you turn to starboard to your right? Because if you turn to port, you'll do what's called wearing, and that's where your entire fleet, where your entire squadron turns with the wind all the way around. But that
Hmm.
may be a tactical situation. You don't want to be any more in that direction. So you may have to tack. And when you tack or come across the wind, these ships have acres of canvas. And when that canvas comes across with the wind pointing straight at the bow of the ship, at the front of the ship,
It'll blow you
you have
backwards.
it can which is called being in irons. And
Hmm.
all of a sudden your ship basically comes to a dead stop. It might even back up slightly. It will, and that puts you lose all steerage way, because your rudder doesn't work if it's not moving through the water.
Hmm.
Your sails don't work if they're not moving forward. None of your methods of turning the ship or adjusting your speed work if the sails are going backwards.
Right.
So that's one consideration that you have to take into account. The other consideration is, in a land Kriegspiel, if we were to say that these four ships were just a division, so you have four brigades,
Hmm.
there could be the possibility that your first brigade is a guards brigade and it's excellent quality, and
Mm-hmm.
you really want it to be your lead off brigade. But it's not that big a deal in 99% of situations. You just countermarch. You just take the whole brigade, you tell it to countermarch, they spin around, not quite that far, and they go the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And as the commander, you're either on your horse or you're on foot, separate from your infantry, and you just move back to the front of your column, no problem.
Mm-hmm.
At sea, you're on this ship, and you're on that ship no matter what happens, unless you really want to get off and have somebody row you to another ship. And the rowboats are going slower than the ships are, so you can't do that while you're in motion. You'd have to stop or
Yeah.
come as close as doesn't matter to a stop to make that work effectively.
Yeah, it's not really a
Especially,
practical thing to do.
exactly, you could get on a boat and just wait for the next ship to come up, and that would work. But aside from that, you couldn't get from the back of a formation to the front of it
Mm-hmm.
without that. And that's why most fleet, if your other option, plus it disrupts your formation. All your ships have who they're supposed to be following and supposed to be taking signals from, and now everything's reversed. So it's called a battle turn away, or it's called or a battle turn or a turn in succession. I'm sorry,
Mm-hmm.
not not
Well,
in
turn
succession.
away is I think where they all turn simultaneous,
Correct.
and then
They're all
turn.
turning
Yeah.
simultaneoly, and I'm using the World War One term
Uh huh.
because the Kaiserlich Marine was famous at Jutland for its battle turn away, where the entire fleet made a turn in place and went off to break contact. Whereas Admiral Beatty did a turn in succession when he was trying to break the battlecruiser fleet off from first scouting group, and ultimately resulted in Fifth Battle Squadron taking a bit of a pounding because in a turn in succession, every ship is turning around the same point. So
Right.
that means if you're at this first rate and you're making a turn because you're getting shot and you don't like it and you start turning, the next ship's going to come up to where you are and follow you in that turn in succession. So you have to figure out what type of turn you want to execute.
Mm-hmm.
You also have to figure out which direction you want to make that turn.
Right.
And this right here, this is going to be this turn to get your formation turned around and going the other way. That's going to take you about 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in a land Kriegsspiel, it's instantaneous as much as makes no difference.
Right.
As soon as the next turn happens, you may lose part of your movement. That turn is everybody about faces, but umpires typically don't enforce an obscene penalty for countermarching.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of these factors that don't matter in a land Kriegsspiel suddenly matter.
Yeah.
You're stuck on one ship, and if you were to quote countermarch your squadron, well now you're at the back and now you can't see.
Mm-hmm.
So the lead ship has got to pass information back to you, and that's going to be very slow, and you don't get the ability to react to stuff for some time. So you have a lot of these factors in play. You also in the battle that we had, and this obviously not the exact number of ships, but we're going to represent this as your force, Marshal.
All
Your
right.
force ended up here, and I'm just going to move the frigates out of the way because they
Yeah.
had their own
I
fight.
think we came up here and then like that. Something like that.
You were starting that maneuver when the battle ended,
Yeah.
but you ended up here, and Carter's force, which it's not, I'm not going to worry about the formation so much, ended up down here.
Yeah.
So, which was his historical for some battles. In fact, for St. Vincent, there was a split in the Royal Navy fleet. But you ended up with this situation where you have one half your fleet, and in a land Kriegsspiel, okay, it may take two turns for a dispatch to get around. In a naval Kriegsspiel, you are fighting two completely different battles, and there is nothing you can do to change that. You
Yeah.
the only way for Marshall to send word down to Carter or vice versa would be for Marshall to actually get send a signal to a frigate, that frigate to take several turns to get down where it's in range of the flagship and relay that signal.
Yeah.
And that's something that in within the scope of a Kriegsspiel is not even practical.
Yeah.
So you're in a land Kriegsspiel, you give me a core of 3 divisions and give me 3 players that have a decent idea as to how divisions work and how to send dispatches, and toss us on a map. 5 minutes, I can have them set up, and then we can just adjust the plan on the fly. In a
Right.
naval Kriegsspiel, that I gave both teams honestly about 40 minutes to come up with their plan and to do their pre-battle conference, because that's it. Once the pre-battle conference is over, everything's over.
Yeah.
But like you said, Marshall, it's very isolating because everybody's fighting their own battle unless your whole force is within spotting distance of each other.
Yeah.
So ultimately, what happened in this battle is that you had the lead elements got stuck in. So Jan was commanding the lead element that was fighting Marshall, because of course Jan and Marshall have to fight even when they don't know they're fighting each other.
Yeah.
And you had a small you actually had 2 players in the element that was fighting Carter's portion of the fleet. Ultimately, one of the players had to leave, and we wound up with just a single player commanding it all. But that's what you had.
Hmm.
You also had Nick, and who was the fleet commander, and 2 other players commanding other elements of the Spanish fleet, which was much larger than the British fleet at this fight. That were all back here, and we're getting those small snippets of information and relaying small snippets. Had this been a land Kriegspiel, because with the exception of one of 2 elements, the Spanish fleet had 5 elements effectively.
Hmm.
With the exception of 2 elements, the whole Spanish fleet was facing Marshall and the frigates. Had
Yeah.
this been a land Kriegspiel, with Nick being able to just ride up to Jan, look at what he can see, conference it, and make that decision, I believe very much you would have had this element of the Royal Navy destroyed,
Hmm.
because they would have been able to bring better than half their force to bear, would have known that what they're dealing with, and been able to bring it all to bear. What you end up with in the battle, and I brought it up in the post-battle briefing, is the whole thing about Kriegspiel is you are not playing the other blocks. The
Hmm.
blocks are completely irrelevant. Kriegspiel is playing chess in the dark.
Hmm.
You're the pieces are irrelevant. You are playing against the mind of the other player, and whoever flinches first loses,
Right.
which is extremely historical for naval warfare in this time period. The Battle of Trafalgar should have been an absolute pasting for the Royal Navy. Letting the enemy cross your T and charging right into the middle of it screams by every book of the time is a dumb idea, and you don't do it.
Hmm.
And yet it worked, because Nelson knew that the Franco Spanish fleet was inexperienced, did not have confident commanders, could not operate as individuals in nearly the capacity that his own ships could, and he could get in their minds. So he charged right into the Spanish fleet, went toe to toe with their flagship, broke their chain of command across the board. He gets killed.
Hmm.
Nelson getting killed means nothing to the battle. The battle's the battle is over whether he dies or lives once
Hmm.
he gives the signal to go. because all the Royal Navy ships, they have confidence. They're very competent at what they're doing. They know what they're doing.
Hmm.
The Franco-Spanish ships, he gets in their heads. He breaks up their chain of command, and the whole thing collapses. And that's something that in a land Kriegspiel, you can get into the players' heads, and that's a big part of every decent sized land Kriegspiel. It's one of the reasons why Sam Miller is so infamous for his rushing, is because you really can't get into his head.
Hmm.
He just attacks, and that's what makes him effective in that I can in the old I continue to attack orders,
Right.
because you're not getting into his head. He will continue to attack.
Yeah.
Whereas other players, if you cause part of their force to break, you may get into their head and make them start rethinking and start acting the way you want them to.
Right.
In a naval Kriegspiel, you have that issue of of getting into the individual player's head. You also have the issue of cutting off communication. If you can force the fleet to split,
Hmm.
if you can force the flagship to be engaged, and now because of gunsmoke and other reasons, it can't signal anybody. You've broken down communication, and then it comes down to who has the better plan and who can improvise better.
Yeah. So yeah, I remember I faced a couple of dilemmas. One was, I know I had another squadron behind me that I was technically in charge of. I had a dilemma on whether, because the Spanish were coming this way from my perspective, and I'm going north, and I'm like, well, do I turn to the left to cut them off and cross their T? Are they going to get out here in front of me? Do I need to send him off to the right? Should I be making that turn? It was really agonizing. And then when we came to this point here where this turn is, the Spanish fleet was turning to the left, and I was like, well, I can try to race around them like this, but doing that would run me into the wind. I'd risk going into irons. So I made the decision instead to turn away, and then I could re-engage after that. But there is, of course, the risk that I let the enemy go. And what I didn't know is that the Spanish were already saying, hey, we're getting out of here. We're going back to France. We're going to France. And at what point I did this maneuver here, turning right, I was done, at least with that particular engagement. It was all over for me. I let them go.
Yeah.
So,
And I will say this, looking at it from the umpire table and having spent a few days reading about the battle again in order to familiarize myself with the historical things, you actually did almost like Nelson did at Cape St. Vincent in some respects. So when you were down here, you had gotten a signal from Carter, from your fleet commander, saying go to battle sail,
mhm,
because Carter's portion of the line was being closed down, and he was closing on the portion of the vanguard that he ultimately fought in his own engagement in this area.
mhm,
However, you made the decision, because you were kind of following the frigates who were headed north. You made the decision separately to not slacken sail, to stay at full sail and
mhm.
use your speed advantage to try to get ahead of the Spanish fleet.
Right.
Had you not done that, the one of two things would have happened in this battle, and that one decision to disobey an order because you thought you knew better and you turned out to be right. Had you not done that, either when by the time you made it north, moving at about half the speed that you had originally, you would have already had your T crossed by the bulk of the Spanish fleet, and you wouldn't have been fighting Jan's vanguard. You would have been fighting Nick and his main line, which had multiple first rates in it. So
Mhm.
your force, which that's actually correct for you, yeah, your force of 8 ships and only two of them being first rates would have been up against about four first rates and double that number of third rates. You'd have been up against roughly about 16 ships
Wow.
on your
Yeah.
on your own. and you would have been caught in a bit of a pickle there. What you ultimately wound up happening was you wound up dealing with essentially one ship because Jan's vanguard force had frigates in it and then his flagship. So your
Right.
entire force was able to pick on his flagship separately because everybody was respecting the general gentleman's agreement to leave the frigates alone until the fight between the big ships is decided.
Hmm.
So you wound up in that situation
Right.
where you were able to dominate the vanguard before the rest of the fleet could get in position and ultimately cause the rest of the fleet to break off. If you hadn't have gone at full sails, you would have you by the time the vanguard is here, you would have been about here, and they would have been like this, crossing your T,
Yeah.
and you would have never been able to get ahead of that.
Hmm.
And ultimately, the bulk of the fleet would have made Cadiz because you would have been you would have had to turn, and both of you would just be in a broadside engagement all the way to Cadiz, and you would be outnumbered significantly because there's no way that Carter and Chris's half of the battle line would have been able to finish off this vanguard and make it north to you in time. So that's how quickly naval battles are decided. That was one 5 minute turn
Yeah.
decided the entire battle.
Wow.
That
Wow.
one decision, that one decision to ignore the order of the fleet commander effectively decided the engagement because it allowed you to cross the T rather than have your T crossed. And in a land engagement, yes, you have your cemetery hills
Hmm.
where that one piece of terrain that gets ignored for a couple of hours by one side and the other side takes it becomes decisive. But at sea, you don't have that.
Hmm.
You don't have a key piece of terrain that you can look on a map and decide that's the key piece of terrain. If I take that, I win. At
Yeah.
sea, it the terrain is
It's flat.
there is nautical terrain.
Yeah.
There are capes, there are things like that. But if you happen to be in an area that doesn't have a cape or an island or something else that you have to maneuver around, you're in a situation where it's all about formation.
Yeah.
Whereas in a land engagement, you can switch formations very quickly to go from column to line of battle in a naval engagement is going to take you several minutes, and as you're doing it, you're exposed to fire the entire time. And
Yeah.
the absolute worst thing a ship takes, and this is something for players that are not used to naval engagements, this right here is is what is called that is what is called having your T crossed.
Right.
This ship has had its T crossed. Technically, it does have first rate would have four, maybe six guns that could fire forward, or they can maneuver guns to fire forward, bow chasers as they're called. But that is not anything that's going to be effective. Not when you're having these would be ships of the line, and you would be having 60, 70, 80 guns firing down your throat, or even if it's just a single ship and it's a one-on-one, a first rate on first rate, you'd have 50 guns firing down your throat
Yeah.
that you can't respond to. And it's a compounding issue because if you have your T crossed, you can't fire back, so they get to fire without suffering any detriments of taking fire, which means they can fire as fast as they possibly can as if they are just doing practice on
Hmm.
you. You also have the compounding effect that these ships aren't armored. It's not This isn't World War II where you have an armored citadel, so a shot that hits you from the bow can go in, or to get really nuts, like World of Warships, where you have if you angle your bow, you can deflect a shot. These are wooden ships. That ball hits, it may deflect. Your bow may bounce a couple of balls, but any ball that penetrates, and most of them probably will because your bow is not armored and it's not so
Hmm. Hmm.
finely angled. That ball gets to go down 100 or more feet of ship
Hmm.
in a straight line.
Wiping
It's
out
like,
crew and everything.
yeah, effectively your ship is a marching column
Hmm.
full of breakable things that turn into splinters.
Yeah.
And there are videos of them doing testing. It was the Vasa Museum did testing of period cannon against a representative piece of period hull made the proper way, and it was launching splinters the size of 3 foot 2x4s
Mm.
out from those cannon hits. So you're looking at a cloud of splinters, and some of them are big splinters flying through a ship, and the cannonball flying through a ship. It's A raking broadside is utterly devastating. If you read period pieces on naval combat, most of the time, once a ship lost a mast or had any sort of issue, and the other ship would pull into position to rake it, they would strike their colors
Yeah.
rather than take that broadside, because it's just going to massacre crew and there's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah.
You
Well,
also open yourself up to losing a lot more rigging from a raking from raking broadsides.
right. I want to take a look at some of the comments now because we've had a number of people. We've got 5 concurrent viewers right now. Um, let's see here. Achilles asks if you prefer naval or land Kriegsspiel or if it's about the same to you.
Honestly, I'm a Marine. Uh, I will generally prefer landing Kriegspiel, land
Hmm.
Kriegspiel over
Hmm.
naval Kriegspiel. However, you wind up you wind up in a situation where if you do just one or just the other, you don't get the full experience.
Hmm.
They're almost two different games,
They sure are.
and they both have enjoyable elements. Uh, if I had to play just one or just the other, generally speaking, I would play land, because land combat is something that speaks to my history, reenacting speaks to my history in the core. But in but as far as interesting elements, naval has a lot of interesting elements that don't come up in a land Kriegspiel.
Hmm. Nick asks, he says the Spanish briefing was requesting to move to Cadiz, and if not possible, move in the direction of Cape St. Vincent. We've already covered that in the podcast here. He then adds, it was specified that engagement with the British should be avoided as they were more experienced sailors and have better and faster ships. Now that's not a question, but the question I am curious about is what were the differences between the British and the Spanish in this scenario? We know what they were in real life. Carter continually referenced, that the British could fire faster than the Spanish. Was that modeled in this game? What differences did you model in this scenario, if any?
So historically, it's touted, and the numbers vary on the historical, but it is touted that the British were typically able to fire two broadsides to the enemy's one, and that was something that they were very proud about. It was also historically in the War of 1812, it was something that came as a shock to them the first time they engaged one of the American super frigates. Was that they engaged believing that the American frigate is bigger, but we're going to fire way faster. And then they discover that, oh, the Americans actually fire at the same rate we do, because
Hmm.
in 1812 we're effectively still British colonials.
Right.
So it came as a bit of a shock to them in that. As far as modeling that in the game, I did model that the British got a +1 bonus on their firing dice to model that they were more accurate and they were firing faster. I did not give them anything near the 2-to-1 bonus and things of that nature. The British fleet was significantly outnumbered, so that was the balance, was to give them a slight increase in that. Another thing historically that happened at Cape St. Vincent was British ships had copper bottoms,
Hmm.
and coppering the bottom of a wooden ship reduced marine life growing on the ship and also marine borers that would bore into the wood and cause you to have to do a lot of repairs. British ships stayed at sea for long periods of time. The British had a lot of maritime commitment, so they spent the extra money to copper their ships,
Mm-hmm.
so that the hull.
You cut out
Sorry
there.
about that.
No,
Yeah,
no
sorry about
worries.
that.
Okay.
Yep. So I did give the British a +1 bonus to their speed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, let's take a look here. Eli talks about, he says, now Eli's a fellow Marine, by the way. I need to get some crayons and send them out to you guys for snacks. My brother is in the Marines, and he used to eat dog treats, so um, that is what it is. Uh, he says, I don't believe in getting into your enemy's head. Yeah, I get it, the OODA loop. Um, I don't know what Eli means by that, but I guess maybe he doesn't think you can get into the opponent's head. But trying to gain the initiative and the upper hand solely on the mental game doesn't work. I learned that the hard way. It says your enemy's mind and personality informs and guides your strategy in specific ways, but at the end of the day, you can't know for sure what he's thinking. It's more workable to focus on what's happening in real time and counter fight authority. And then, of course, he says, Semper Fi, brother. Hmm. What do you make of that, Tack?
So as far as that goes, you if you make your I do agree that if you make your sole strategy in I'm going to get in his head, you'll wind up in bad situations.
Mm-hmm.
You should use if you know your enemy, and this is getting into Sun Tzu, if you know yourself and know your enemy, you will not be defeated even in 1,000 battles. But if you know your opponent's mindset and how they generally tend to play, there are things that you can do in order to either play into that. Famously, when I played against you, you knew that my mindset was going to do a number of things,
Mm-hmm.
and I knew with your mindset, I knew there were a couple of things that I could do in order to generate what I call confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
In that, okay, I'm going to give him what I think he thinks I'm going to do in order to get him to move in a certain way. Ultimately, we ended up playing each other against that in a bit. So yeah, it's
Uh-huh.
not always successful, but it is something that you do have to inform. And ultimately, for instance, in this battle, the Spanish fleet still had enough left to run right through you and get to Cadiz. They would have taken more losses, but they
Mm-hmm.
could have broken through. And ultimately, they made the decision that nope, we're going to go for a secondary objective because our primary objective is going to cost us too much.
Mm-hmm.
While they, and a lot of that came down to the fact that their southern force couldn't communicate with their northern force. If their southern force was able to communicate with their northern force, they
They
would have been
might
able to
have,
tell them
yeah.
that they were fighting half the fleet with just a small portion of their own, which meant that the rest of their fleet could steamroll you.
Mm-hmm.
So in a land Kriegsspiel, the psychological aspect is honestly less important
Mm-hmm.
because you're playing on a collective consciousness. You're playing on, especially in a large game like a Grand Gettysburg, where you have an army commander, multiple corps commanders. You're playing on a collective consciousness across that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have one player, say and I use him because he's easy to use for this. You're fighting Sam Miller, so he's going to continue to attack. So
Right.
if you build a strong defense and start to work on his flanks, you will draw him in and crush him.
Right.
But then that commander, is working under Justin as a corps commander under Crises,
Mm-hmm.
and he's wily and does unexpected things. But so if you know all of those commanders by name, you may be able to put together an idea of what they're going to do. But
Right.
they have that collective consciousness that once you've established, I think this is how this commander is going to behave, and all of a sudden they behave in a totally different way because their corps commander gives them an order and they obey it.
Yeah. Achilles
In a
says,
naval,
"Go ahead, go ahead. I
oh,
didn't
in
mean to
a
cut you off."
in a naval engagement, because you wind up with a lot more separation, you wind up with signals that are much less informative and no conferencing between players. You can play on an individual player's consciousness or fears to a much greater degree and cause that situation where everybody thinks they're winning or everybody thinks they're losing at
Mm,
different points. And you wind up making the right person flinch at the right time, and that causes that cascade failure.
yeah.
Um, Jan believed he was losing badly, and he was, but he was staying in the fight because he thought he had it. He thought he had a lot of support coming up that wound up deciding that no, they must be Jan must be fighting the whole British fleet. We're going to leave.
Mm-hmm.
When ultimately they wound up accidentally, because I don't think it was part of their original battle plan. Their southern force had wound up baiting half the fleet out of position.
Mm-hmm. Well, Achilles says, "Except for Marshall, it's easy to know what he is thinking," and then he adds the word squirrel. Achilles told me yesterday he has notes on how I play. He's certainly seen enough of my games. So I probably don't want to play against Achilles. He'll probably just run circles around me. Um,
Well, there are a few of us at the IKS that do this. It's I'm reading the notes as well, and um, and Eli's kind of talking about something that several of us that also do this have been discussing. Achilles being one, myself, Justin, Carter. We've been talking about doing some almost like a command and staff college sort of thing on a small scale at some point, probably in the fall or winter when we have more time and we're not going everywhere.
mhm,
But looking at something along those lines for kind of teaching this how to do player analysis and things of those nature that they're you wouldn't call them advanced concepts, but they're concepts that they're not necessary to play Kriegspiel. But if you're somebody that's somewhat new to Kriegspiel or you watch a lot of games and you wonder why there are certain players that do very well
mhm,
that maybe don't have a particular idiom. I keep throwing Sam out there because he does have an idiom
mhm.
that he has followed pretty religiously through a lot of games, and that is that he's very aggressive. So
Right.
you have other players that maybe like uh, Justin or Achilles that they adjust their play style based on who they're fighting, based on who's in the game.
Mm,
For a live, they're able to see who's actually in the game. For a play by post, they may have a general idea of who might be on the other side, and they adjust their play style by analyzing past performance. And this is something that is done. It's done in modern. It's done in sports, obviously, watching game tape
mhm.
and learning how the other team plays. It's done in warfare. You're figuring out who your opponent is and how they perform under different circumstances and tailor how you're going to engage them based on their performance.
Right. Well, I wonder how you guys characterize me. I think Achilles thinks I'm easily distracted. He could very well be correct. Um, but he says the notes, I believe he's talking about the notes. He says they enhance the experience for me anyway. It's part of what I enjoy in the game. And yeah, I've got to say, this is one of these cool games or environments where you literally do match wits with another person, and because the players aren't really privy to the rule set, you don't have someone who's gaming the rules, so newcomers have just as much odds of winning as a person who's been there a long time. It really is a battle of wits. And apparently, even old veterans like myself, who's been doing Kriegsspiel for ages, I lose quite often, and so to win here was a surprise for me, a pleasant one. But yeah, it's just a really unique gaming experience, and you don't get this with anything else. Uh, Tack, any final words or comments before we wrap up?
For anybody that's watched 6-hour mega stream. I watched a bit over half of it last night, trying to figure out mistakes I had made as an umpire. Age of Sail is a very new system to Kriegspiel.
Hmm.
I have an excellent partner in figuring out rule sets and devising it. Peter Robbins has been working on this project, and he's much better at naval things than I am, especially from the gaming perspective.
Hmm.
So this is very much a work in progress, and there will be a lot of tweaks, a lot of adjustments. This is one of the reasons I haven't gone into much detail as far as the system itself. One, because players shouldn't play the system.
Right.
The system should be able to make realistic results for realistic scenarios.
Hmm.
So that's what I'm working on to make sure that happens. I thought it was very ironic that the Battle of Cape St. Vincent went very similar in some ways to the historical battle, despite it being a Kriegsspiel.
Hmm.
And despite neither side really directly attempting to recreate that battle,
Hmm.
the result ultimately. In fact, the number of ships struck, the number of ships that struck, 4 Spanish ships, is the historical amount
Hmm.
that struck in that battle. So it wound up being very historical, despite, so it shows that there's a lot of promise in the system, and there just needs
Hmm.
to be a little more work to tweak and get things easier for players and easier for umpires.
Yeah,
Um,
I dropped a lot of thoughts and knowledge throughout that live stream based on my own experience. Yeah, it's while it's obvious it's a new system and it takes some time to kind of get your sea legs, if you will. It does have a lot of promise, and it did seem to work very well. There's a lot of elements in it, though. You know, the communication is a huge thing. I mean, there's just so many different variables here. I almost think it's probably more complicated than a land-based Kriegspiel, but that could just be that we have so much experience on land. And again, water is a new medium for us. But there you have it. So.
Yeah, I think a big complicating factor for naval is that without the ability to directly communicate in long form with your neighboring commanders,
Hmm.
in land Kriegspiel, we're fine with I'm in the woods and I get a picture of my own block, and that's all I get.
Hmm.
Because I can communicate with my corps commander, I can communicate with the division commander to my left and right.
You could
I know
ride
where
over
they're
to
at.
them.
Correct. In a naval Kriegsspiel, if you get a screenshot, whatever that screenshot is what you get. And you can't just go, I want to see what's to the west, and I'll just go over there for a bit. If you do, you're dragging a portion of the fleet with you, and it's going to take a while. So
Mm.
I think that is an element that it creates in this Kriegspiel, with it being a new system and having players that don't have the naval experience. I wound up spending far more time in in player time working on working on explaining different things that you see, different things that you do, letting players that aren't getting any updates know that you're continuing to sail in the same direction and there's nothing to update you on at all.
Yeah.
And doing things of that nature, then I would spend in a land based Kriegspiel because it's more understood.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, as far as umpire time, it did take a while. Obviously, new system. I'm still learning it. It's not second nature to me at getting there. And ultimately, I wound up in a situation where I only had myself and Peter as umpires for
Hmm.
for the most action packed part of the game. I had one other umpire, so that
Yeah.
always slows the game down.
Yeah. It took some time, but it was still a worthwhile experience. I remarked on that several times in the live stream that this was kind of new. It was going to take time, and it's worthwhile to kind of stick it out and see it to the end, and learn and gather what you can because the future games are just going to be that much better. So,
Agreed.
tack.
I will say, from a replayability perspective,
Hmm.
Naval Kriegspiel is probably going to wind up being easier to create a pickup scenario
Hmm.
because build two balanced fleets.
Hmm.
And under this map table is actually a table that Peter Robbins gave me that's just a blank ocean. And
Hmm.
you can just drop them. You don't have to have terrain. It's not, we're fighting the 14th battle of the Mets map and
Hmm.
everybody knows where to go. It's blank ocean. You can drop a fleet anywhere and then they figure it out as they go.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of replayability to this. So ultimately, it's something that's going to not just be a specialized where we're going to recreate historical battles. There's a lot of replayability for pickup games.
Yeah. All right. Well, Tack, I want to thank you for being here. This was a really long show. Normally, we only run 30 minutes. Today,
Sorry about
we've
that.
run an hour and 10. That's okay, though. This was a new experience for all of us. It was very insightful and very informative, so it was absolutely okay to go on. I think it's a lot of value added for our viewers. We had good viewership today. I want to thank you for being on. For those of you out there, if you want to support us, please go on over to patreon.com/Kriegsspiel. I'll drop that in the comments. Subscribe and support us on Patreon. Anyone who does support us on Patreon, you get the K22 rule set absolutely for free. I send that to you. I add you. What I actually do is I add you to the distribution list. That rule set does get updated periodically as time goes by, so it is something you want to check back. Yes, you can print it off, but you also want to check back to see any changes. Again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel. That's it for today, and I will see you all on our next adventure.